Hi, friends. So I'm doing a recording of Cultish. This is fair use, just for educational purposes. Sorry about voice. And there's probably going to be ambient noise because I don't know how to directly record from the internet. So I apologize in advance. And I do think this is very important information that we need to learn more about cults. And the blurb for this talks about how cult influence, the social science of cult influence, how cultish groups from Jonestown and Scientology to Soul Cycle and social media gurus use language as the ultimate form of power. What makes cults so intriguing and frightening? What makes them powerful? The reason why so many of us binge Manson documentaries by the dozen and fall down rabbit holes researching suburban moms gone QAnon is because we're looking for a satisfying explanation for what causes people to join and, more importantly, stay in extreme groups. We secretly want to know, how could it happen to me? Amanda Montell's argument is that on some level it already has. Our culture tends to provide pretty flimsy answers to questions of cult influence, mostly having to do with vague talk of brainwashing. But the true answer has nothing to do with freaky mind control wizardry or Kool-Aid. In Cultish, Montell argues that the key to manufacturing intense ideology, community, and us-them attitudes all come down to language. In both positive ways and shadowy ones, cultish language is something we hear and are influenced by every single day. Through juicy storytelling and I think they meant to say cutting edge original research, Montell exposes the verbal elements that make a wide spectrum of communities cultish, revealing how they affect followers of groups as notorious as Heaven's Gate, but also how they how they pervade our modern startups, Peloton leaderboards, and Instagram feeds. Incisive and darkly funny, this enrapturing take. Are they trying to cult this blurb here? This enrapturing take on the curious social science of power and belief will make you hear the fanatical language of cultish everywhere. So that's the blurb for the book from my library. And now we begin.
Harper Wave and Harper Audio present Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. Read by Anne-Marie Gideon. Note from the author. Some names and identifying details have been changed to protect sources' privacy. Part 1. Repeat after me. 1. It started with a prayer. Tasha Samar was 13 years old the first time she heard the bewitching buzz of their voices. It was their turban-to-toe white ensembles and meditation malas that first caught her eye, but it was how they spoke that beckoned her through the front door. She heard them through the open window of a Kundalini yoga studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The prayers were so strange, all in another language. Tasha, now 29, tells me over macadamia milk lattes at an outdoor cafe in West Hollywood. We're less than a few miles away from the epicenter of the sinister life she led until only 3 years ago. Judging by her crisp cream button-down and satiny blowout, you'd never guess she could once tie a turban as naturally as any other young woman in this courtyard could toss her hair into a top knot. Yeah, I could still do it now if I had to, Tasha assures me, her meticulous acrylics clacking on her porcelain mug. Tasha, a first-generation Russian-American Jew who experienced an agonizing lack of belonging her entire childhood, was struck by this yoga group's sense of closeness. So she peeked her head into the lobby and asked the receptionist who they were. The front desk girl started telling me the basics. The phrase, the science of the mind, was used a lot, Tasha reflects. I didn't know what it meant. I just remembered thinking, wow, I really want to try that. Tasha found out when the next yoga class would be, and her parents let her attend. You didn't need to be a permanent member of the group to take a class. The only requirement was an open heart. Learning and reciting their foreign prayers, all directed toward a man with a long, peppery beard whose photograph was plastered throughout the dimly lit studio, cast a spell over tween Tasha. It felt ancient, she says, like I was a part of something holy. Who was this group in all white? The Healthy, Happy, Holy Organization, or 3HO, a Sikh-derived alternative religion founded in the 1970s, which hosts Kundalini yoga classes all over the U.S. The guy with the beard? Their captivating, well-connected leader, Harbhajan Singh Khalsa, or Yogi Bhajan, who claimed, to much contest, to be the official religious and administrative head of all Western Sikhs, and who was worth hundreds of millions of dollars by the time he died in 1993. The language? Gurmukhi, the writing system of modern Punjabi and Sikh scripture. The ideology? To obey Yogi Bhajan's strict New Age teachings, which included abstaining from meat and alcohol, surrendering to his arranged marriages, waking up at 4:30 every morning to read scripture and attend yoga class, and not associating with anyone who didn't follow, or who wouldn't be following soon. Booze was 3HO heresy, so in place of happy hour, everyone guzzled gallons of tea. Specifically, members drank Yogi tea, a multi-million-dollar brand you yourself can find in almost every American grocery store. This was no accident. Yogi tea was created and owned by Yogi Bhajan. It's not 3HO's only corporate endeavor. Among the group's many enterprises is the $500 million company Akal Security, which holds contracts with everyone from NASA to immigration detention centers. What's the word for late capitalism in Gurmukhi? As soon as she turned 18, Tasha moved to Los Angeles, one of 3HO's home bases, and for 8 years, she dedicated her entire life, all her time and money, to the group. After a series of exhaustive trainings, she became a full-time Kundalini yoga instructor, and within months was attracting big-name, spiritually curious celebrities to her Malibu classes. Demi Moore, Russell Brand, Owen Wilson, Adrian Brody. Even if they didn't become full-time followers, their attendance was good PR for 3HO. Tasha's swamis, teachers, praised her for raking in the dollars and allegiances of the rich, famous, and seeking. At the cafe, Tasha unsheaths her phone from an inky black clutch to show me old photos of her and Demi Moore, garbed in ghost white short shorts and turbans, twirling around a desert retreat backdropped by Joshua trees. Tasha slowly blinks her eyelash extensions as a bewildered smile blooms across her face, as if to say, yeah, I can't believe I did this shit either. Obedience like Tasha's promised to yield great rewards. Just learn the right words and they'd be yours. There was a mantra to attract your soulmate, one to acquire lots of money, one to look better than ever, one to give birth to a more evolved, higher vibration generation of children. Tasha divulges. Disobey, you'd come back in the next life on a lower vibration. Mastering 3HO's secret mantras and code words made Tasha feel separate from everyone else she knew, chosen, on a higher vibration. Solidarity like this intensified when everyone in the group was assigned a new name. A name giver, appointed by Yogi Bhajan, used something called tantric numerology as an algorithm to determine followers' special 3HO monikers, which they received in exchange for a fee. All women were given the same middle name, Kaur, while men were all christened Singh. Everyone shared the last name Khalsa, like one big family. Getting your new name was the biggest deal ever, Tasha says. Most people would change their names on their driver's licenses. Until last year, Tasha Samar's California ID read Dayakur Khalsa. It might not have been totally apparent, what with the peaceable yoga classes and high-profile supporters, but there was a dangerous undercurrent to 3HO. Psychological and sexual abuse by Yogi Bhajan, forced fasting and sleep deprivation, threats of violence toward anyone attempting to leave the group, suicides, even an unsolved murder. Once followers fully adopted the group's jargon, higher-ups were able to weaponize it. Threats were structured in phrases like Piscean consciousness, negative mind, lizard brain. Take a bite of a friend's meaty burger or fail to attend yoga class and lizard brain, lizard brain, lizard brain would play on a loop in your mind. Often, familiar English terms that once held a positive meaning were recast to signify something threatening. Like old soul, Tasha tells me. To an average English speaker, old soul connotes someone with wisdom beyond their years. It's a compliment. But in 3HO, it incited dread. It meant someone had been coming back life after life, incarnation after incarnation, and they couldn't get it right, she explains. Even 3 years after escaping 3HO, Tasha still shudders whenever she hears the phrase. In 2009, shortly after Tasha arrived in Southern California to give her life to 3HO, another 18-year-old moved to LA to start a new life. Her name was Alyssa Clark, and she'd come down the coast from Oregon to start college. Afraid of gaining the freshman 15, Alyssa decided to try joining a gym. She had always struggled with body image, and she was intimidated by LA's formidable fitness scene. So, over holiday break, when she reunited with a family member who'd recently started a new workout program, dropped a ton of weight, and beamed with the honeymoon glow of fresh muscle tone, Alyssa thought, damn, I have to check that out. The new workout was called Crossfit, and there was a location right near Alyssa's dorm. Upon returning from break, she and her boyfriend signed up for a beginner's workshop. The sweaty, sculpted instructors oozed masculine enthusiasm as they introduced Alyssa to a whole new world of terminology she'd never heard before. The gym wasn't called a gym, it was a box. Instructors weren't teachers or trainers, they were coaches. Their workouts consisted of functional movements. You had your WOD, workout of the day, which might consist of snatches and clean and jerks. You had your BPs, bench presses, your BSs, back squats, your C2Bs, chest to bars, and your inevitable DOMs, delayed onset muscle soreness. Who doesn't love a catchy acronym? Alyssa was captivated by how tight-knit all these CrossFitters seemed. They had such a culture and was dead set on mastering their private patois. A portrait of CrossFit's founder, Greg Glassman, known then to devotees as the WOD Father, or simply Coach, hung on the wall of Alyssa's box next to one of his most famous quotes, a fitness proverb that would soon sear into her brain. Eat meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, some fruit, little starch, and no sugar. Keep intake to levels that will support exercise, but not body fat. Practice and train major lifts. Master the basics of gymnastics. Bike, run, swim, row, hard and fast, 5 or 6 days per week. Alyssa was taken with how CrossFit focused on shaping members' mentalities, not just inside the box, but everywhere. When driving trainees to work harder, coaches would bellow, "Beast mode," a motivational phrase that reverberated through Alyssa's thoughts at school and work, too. To help you internalize the CrossFit philosophy, they'd repeat EIE, which meant everything is everything. When Alyssa noticed everyone at her box was wearing Lululemon, she went out and dropped $400 on designer workout swag. Even Lululemon had its own distinctive vernacular. It was printed all over their shopping bags, so customers would walk out of the store carrying mantras like, "There is little difference between addicts and fanatic athletes. Visualize your eventual demise," and "Friends are more important than money," all coined by their so-called tribe leader, Lululemon's founder, Chip Wilson, an aging G.I. Joe type just like Greg Glassman, whose acolytes were equally devout. Who knew fitness could inspire such religiosity? As soon as Alyssa learned that most CrossFitters followed a paleo diet, she cut out gluten and sugar. If she made plans to go out of town and knew she wouldn't be able to make her normal workout time, she quickly alerted someone at the box, lest they publicly shame her in their Facebook group for no-showing. Coaches and members were all fooling around with each other, so after Alyssa and her boyfriend split, she started hooking up with a trainer named Flex. Real name, Andy. He changed it after joining the box. So here's the big question. What do Alyssa's and Tasha's stories have in common? The answer: they were both under cultish influence. If you're skeptical of applying the same charged cult label to both 3HO and CrossFit, good. You should be. For now, let's agree on this. Even though one of our protagonists ended up broke, friendless, and riddled with PTSD, and the other got herself a strained hamstring, a codependent friend with benefits, and a few too many pairs of overpriced leggings, what Tasha Samar and Alyssa Clark irrefutably share is that one day they woke up on different sides of Los Angeles and realized they were in so deep they weren't even speaking recognizable English anymore. Though the stakes and consequences of their respective affiliations differed considerably, the methods used to assert such power, to create community and solidarity, to establish an us and a them, to align collective values, to justify questionable behavior, to instill ideology and inspire fear, were uncannily, cultishly similar. And the most compelling techniques had little to do with drugs, sex, shaved heads, remote communes, drapey caftans, or Kool-Aid. Instead, they had everything to do with language. 2. Cultish groups are an all-out American obsession. One of the most gushed-over debut novels of the 2010s was Emma Cline's The Girls, chronicling a teenager's summer-long dalliance with a Manson-type cult in the late 1960s. HBO's 2015 Scientology documentary, Going Clear, was critically deemed impossible to ignore. Devoured with equal gusto was Netflix's 2018 docuseries Wild Wild Country, which told of the controversial guru Osho, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and his Rajneeshpuram commune. Embellished by an irresistibly hip playlist and vintage footage of his red-clad apostles, the show earned an Emmy and millions of online streams. All any of my friends could talk about the week I started writing this book was the 2019 folk horror film Midsummer, about a fictional, murderous Dionysian cult in Sweden characterized by psychedelic-fueled sex rituals and human sacrifices. And all anyone is talking about now as I edit this book in 2020 are The Vow and Seduced, dueling docuseries about Nexium, the self-help scam turned sex trafficking ring. The well of cult-inspired art and intrigue is bottomless. When it comes to gurus and their groupies, we just can't seem to look away. I once heard a psychologist explain that rubbernecking results from a very real physiological response. You see an auto accident, or any disaster, or even just news of a disaster, like a headline, and your brain's amygdala, which controls emotions, memory, and survival tactics, starts firing signals to your problem-solving frontal cortex to try to figure out whether this event is a direct danger to you. You enter fight or flight mode, even if you're just sitting there. The reason millions of us binge cult documentaries or go down rabbit holes researching groups from Jonestown to QAnon is not that there's some twisted voyeur inside us all that's inexplicably attracted to darkness. We've all seen enough car crashes and read enough cult exposés. If all we wanted was a spooky fix, we'd be bored already. But we're not bored, because we're still hunting for a satisfying answer to the question of what causes seemingly normal people to join, and more important, stay in, fanatical fringe groups with extreme ideologies. We're scanning for threats, on some level wondering, is everyone susceptible to cultish influence? Could it happen to you? Could it happen to me? And if so, how? Our culture tends to provide pretty flimsy answers to questions of cult influence, mostly having to do with vague talk of brainwashing. Why did all those people die in Jonestown? They drank the Kool-Aid. Why don't abused polygamist sister wives get the hell out of Dodge as soon as they can? They're mind controlled. Simple as that. But it's actually not that simple. In fact, brainwashing is a pseudoscientific concept that the majority of psychologists I interviewed denounce. More on that in a bit. Truer answers to the question of cult influence can only arrive when you ask the right questions. What techniques do charismatic leaders use to exploit people's fundamental needs for community and meaning? How do they cultivate that kind of power? The answer, as it turns out, is not some freaky, mind-bending wizardry that happens on a remote commune where everyone dons flower crowns and dances in the sun. That's called Coachella, which one could argue is its own kind of cult. The real answer all comes down to words, delivery. From the crafty redefinition of existing words and the invention of new ones, to powerful euphemisms, secret codes, renamings, buzzwords, chants and mantras, speaking in tongues, forced silence, even hashtags. Language is the key means by which all degrees of cult-like influence occur. Exploitative spiritual gurus know this, but so do pyramid schemers, politicians, CEOs of startups, online conspiracy theorists, workout instructors, even social media influencers. In both positive ways and shadowy ones, cult language is in fact something we hear and are swayed by every single day. Our speech in regular life, at work, in spin class, on Instagram, is evidence of our varying degrees of cult membership. You just have to know what to listen for. Indeed, while we're distracted by the Manson family's peculiar outfits and other flashy cult iconography, what we wind up missing is the fact that one of the biggest factors in getting people to a point of extreme devotion and keeping them there is something we cannot see. The infatuation with cult garb runs deep. In 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate, a UFO fringe religion we'll talk about in part 2, participated in a mass suicide, all wearing matching pairs of black and white 93 Nike Decade sneakers. 2 surviving Heaven's Gate followers maintained that their leader chose the footwear for no particular reason other than that he found a good bulk deal. Nike hastily discontinued the style after the tragedy. Nothing like a cult suicide to ruin your product's good name. But that made the sneakers an instant collector's item. At the time of this writing, 22 years post Heaven's Gate, a pair of size 12 Nike Decades from 1993 was listed on eBay for $6,600. Though cult language comes in different varieties, all charismatic leaders, from Jim Jones to Jeff Bezos to Soul Cycle instructors, use the same basic linguistic tools. This is a book about the language of fanaticism in its many forms, a language I'm calling Cultish, like English, Spanish, or Swedish. Part 1 of this book will investigate the language we use to talk about cultish groups, busting some widely believed myths about what the word cult even means. Then parts 2 through 5 will unveil the key elements of cultish language and how they've worked to inveigle followers of groups as destructive as Heaven's Gate and Scientology, but also how they pervade our day-to-day vocabularies. In these pages, we'll discover what motivates people throughout history and now to become fanatics, both for good and for evil. Once you understand what the language of cultish sounds like, you won't be able to unhear it. Language is a leader's charisma. It's what empowers them to create a mini-universe, a system of values and truths, and then compel their followers to heed its rules. In 1945, the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote that language is human beings' element, just as water is the element of fish. So it's not as if Tasha's foreign mantras and Alyssa's acronyms played some small role in molding their cult experiences. Rather, because words are the medium through which belief systems are manufactured, nurtured, and reinforced, their fanaticism fundamentally could not exist without them. Without language, there are no beliefs, ideology, or religion. John E. Joseph, a professor of applied linguistics at the University of Edinburgh, wrote to me from Scotland. These concepts require a language as a condition of their existence. Without language, there are no cults. Certainly, you can hold beliefs without explicitly articulating them, and it's also true that if Tasha or Alyssa did not want to buy into their leader's messages, no collection of words could have forced them into it. But, with a glimmer of willingness, language can do so much to squash independent thinking, obscure truths, encourage confirmation bias, and emotionally charge experiences such that no other way of life seems possible. The way a person communicates can tell us a lot about who they've been associating with, who they've been influenced by, how far their allegiance goes. The motives behind culty-sounding language are not always crooked. Sometimes they're quite healthy, like to boost solidarity or to rally people around a humanitarian mission. One of my best friends works for a cancer nonprofit who brings back amusing stories of the love-bombing buzzwords and quasi-religious mantras they repeat on end to keep fundraisers hyped. Someday is today. This is our week of winning. Let's fly above and beyond. You are the greatest generation of warriors and heroes in this quest for a cancer cure. It reminds me of the way multi-level marketing people talk, she tells me, referencing culty direct sales companies like Mary Kay and Amway. More on these later. It's cult-like, but for a good cause. And hey, it works. In part 5 of this book, we'll learn about all sorts of woo-woo chants and hymns used in cult fitness, studios that may sound extremist to skeptical outsiders, but aren't actually all that destructive when you take a closer listen. Whether wicked or well-intentioned, language is a way to get members of a community on the same ideological page, to help them feel like they belong to something big. Language provides a culture of shared understanding, said Eileen Barker, a sociologist who studies new religious movements at the London School of Economics. But wherever there are fanatically worshipped leaders and belief-bound cliques, some level of psychological pressure is at play. This could be as quotidian as your average case of FOMO, or as treacherous as being coerced to commit violent crimes. Quite frankly, the language is everything, one ex-Scientologist told me in a hushed tone during an interview. It's what insulates you. It makes you feel special, like you're in the know, because you have this other language to communicate with. Before we can get into the nuts and bolts of cultish language, however, we must focus on a key definition. What does the word cult even mean exactly? As it turns out, coming up with one conclusive definition is tricky at best. Over the course of researching and writing this book, my understanding of the word has only become hazier and more fluid. I'm not the only one flummoxed by how to pin down cult. I recently conducted a small street survey near my home in Los Angeles, where I asked a couple dozen strangers what they thought the word meant. Answers ranged from a small group of believers led by a deceptive figure with too much power, to any group of people who are really passionate about something, all the way to, well, a cult could be anything, couldn't it? You could have a coffee cult or a surfing cult. And not a single response was delivered with certainty. There's a reason for this semantic murkiness. It's connected to the fact that the fascinating etymology of cult, which I'll chronicle shortly, corresponds precisely to our society's ever-changing relationship to spirituality, community, meaning, and identity. A relationship that's gotten rather weird. Language change is always reflective of social change, and over the decades, as our sources of connection and existential purpose have shifted due to phenomena like social media, increased globalization, and withdrawal from traditional religion, we've seen the rise of more alternative subgroups, some dangerous, some not so much. Cult has evolved to describe them all. I found that cult has become one of those terms that can mean something totally different depending on the context of the conversation and the attitudes of the speaker. It can be invoked as a damning accusation implying death and destruction, a cheeky metaphor suggesting not much more than some matching outfits and enthusiasm, and pretty much everything in between. In modern discourse, someone could apply the word cult to a new religion, a group of online radicals, a startup, and a makeup brand all in the same breath. While working at a beauty magazine a few years ago, I promptly noticed how commonplace it was for cosmetics brands to invoke cult as a marketing term to generate buzz for new product launches. A cursory search for the word in my old work inbox yielded thousands of results. Take a sneak peek at the next cult phenomenon, reads a press release from a trendy makeup line, swearing that the new face powder from their so-called cult lab will send beauty junkies and makeup fanatics into a frenzy. Another pitch from a skincare company vows that their $150 cult favorite set of CBD-infused elixirs is more than skincare. It's the priceless gift of an opportunity to decompress and love oneself in order to handle whatever life throws at them. A priceless opportunity to handle anything? The promised benefits of this eye cream sound not unlike those of a spiritual grifter. Confusing as this panoply of cult definitions might sound, we seem to be navigating it okay. Sociolinguists have found that overall, listeners are quite savvy at making contextual inferences about the meaning and stakes implied whenever a familiar word is used in conversation. Generally, we're able to infer that when we talk about the cult of Jonestown, we mean something different from the cult of CBD skincare or Taylor Swift fans. Of course, there is room for misinterpretation, as there always is with language. But overall, most seasoned conversationalists understand that when we describe certain fitness fiends as cult followers, we might be referencing their intense, indeed religious-seeming devotion, but we're probably not worried that they're going to drown in financial ruin or stop speaking to their families. At least, not as a condition of their membership. Regarding Swifties or soul cyclers, cult may serve as more of a metaphor, similar to how one might compare school or work to a prison as a way to describe an oppressive environment or harsh higher-ups, without raising concerns about literal jail cells. When I sent my initial interview request to Tanya Lerman, a Stanford psychological anthropologist and well-known scholar of fringe religions, she responded with, "Dear Amanda, I would be happy to talk. I do think that SoulCycle is a cult." Smiley face. But during our conversation later, she clarified that the statement was more tongue-in-cheek and something she'd never say formally, which of course I already understood. We'll hear more from Tanya later. With groups like SoulCycle, cult works to describe members' fierce fidelity to a cultural coterie that may very well remind us of some aspects of a Manson-level dangerous group. The monetary and time commitment, the conformism, and the exalted leadership, all of which certainly have the potential to turn toxic, but not the wholesale isolation from outsiders or life-threatening lies and abuse. We know without needing to explicitly state it that the possibility of death or a physical inability to leave is not on the table. But, like everything in life, there is no good cult, bad cult binary. Cultishness falls on a spectrum. Stephen Hassan, a mental health counselor, author of The Cult of Trump, and one of the country's foremost cult experts, has described an influence continuum representing groups from healthy and constructive to unhealthy and destructive. Hassan says that groups toward the destructive end use three kinds of deception: omission of what you need to know, distortion to make whatever they're saying more acceptable, and outright lies. One of the major differences between so-called ethical cults, Hassan references sports and music bands, and noxious ones, is that an ethical group will be upfront about what they believe in, what they want from you, and what they expect from your membership. And leaving comes with few, if any, serious consequences. If you say, "I found a better band," or "I'm not into basketball anymore," the other people won't threaten you. Hassan clarifies, you won't have irrational fears that you'll go insane or be possessed by demons. Although, stan culture, camps of online superfans who religiously worship and defend music stars like Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga, and Beyonce, has gotten dicier than the celebrity fandom of generations past. In 2014, a psychiatric study found that celebrity stans tend to struggle with psychosocial issues like body dysmorphia, cosmetic surgery obsession, and poor judgment of interpersonal boundaries, as well as mental health conditions like anxiety and social dysfunction. The same study found that stans may also display qualities of narcissism, stalking behavior, and disassociation. We'll talk more about the ups and downs of pop culture cults in Part 6. Or, in the case of our former 3HO member, Tasha, turn into a cockroach. To my core, Tasha answered when I asked if she truly believed the group's promise that if she committed a serious offense, like sleeping with her guru or taking her life, she'd come back as the world's most reviled insect. Tasha also believed that if you died in the presence of someone holy, you'd reincarnate higher. Once, she spotted a cockroach in a public restroom and was convinced it was a swami who'd done something awful in a past life and was trying to come back on a higher vibration. I was like, oh my God, he's trying to die around me because I'm an elevated teacher. Tasha shivered. When the cockroach scuttled up into the floor, Tasha opened the plug so it wouldn't have the honor of drowning in her proximity. I freaked out and ran out of the bathroom, she recounted. That was probably the pinnacle of my insanity. By contrast, our CrossFitter, Alyssa Clark, told me that the scariest possible outcome for her might be getting called lazy on Facebook if she skipped a workout. Or if she decided to quit the box and start spinning instead, heaven forbid, her old pals and paramours might slowly dissolve from her life. It is to qualify this wide gamut of cult-like communities that we've come up with colloquial modifiers like cult followed, culty, and, indeed, cultish. 3. It's really no coincidence that cults are having such a proverbial moment. The 21st century has produced a climate of socio-political unrest and mistrust of long-established institutions, like church, government, big pharma, and big business. It's the perfect societal recipe for making new and unconventional groups. Everything from Reddit incels to woo-woo wellness influencers who promise to provide answers that the conventional ones couldn't supply seem freshly appealing. Add the development of social media and declining marriage rates, and culture-wide feelings of isolation are at an all-time high. Civic engagement is at a record-breaking low. In 2019, Forbes labeled loneliness an epidemic. Human beings are really bad at loneliness. We're not built for it. People have been attracted to tribes of like-minded others ever since the time of ancient humans, who communed in close-knit groups for survival. But beyond the evolutionary advantage, community also makes us feel a mysterious thing called happiness. Neuroscientists have found that our brains release feel-good chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin when we partake in transcendent bonding rituals, like group chanting and singing. Our nomadic hunter-gatherer ancestors used to pack their village squares to engage in ritualistic dances, though there was no practical need for them. Modern citizens of countries like Denmark and Canada, whose governments prioritize community connection through high-quality public transportation, neighborhood co-ops, etc., self-report higher degrees of satisfaction and fulfillment. All kinds of research points to the idea that humans are social and spiritual by design. Our behavior is driven by a desire for belonging and purpose. We're cultish by nature. This fundamental human itch for connection is touching, but when steered in the wrong direction, it can also cause an otherwise judicious person to do utterly irrational things. Consider this classic study. In 1951, Swarthmore College psychologist Solomon Asch gathered together half a dozen students to conduct a simple vision test. Asch showed 4 vertical lines to the participants, all but one of whom were in on the experiment, and asked them to point to the 2 that were the same length. There was one obviously correct answer, which you needed 0 skills other than eyesight to figure out. But Asch found that if the first 5 students pointed to a blatantly wrong answer, 75% of test subjects ignored their better judgment and agreed with the majority. This ingrained fear of alienation, this compulsion to conform, is part of what makes being part of a group feel so right. It's also what charismatic leaders, from 3HO's Yogi Bhajan to CrossFit's Greg Glassman, have learned to channel and exploit. It was once true that when in need of community and answers, people defaulted to organized religion. But increasingly, this is no longer the case. Every day, more and more Americans are dropping their affiliations with mainstream churches and scattering. The spiritual but not religious label is something most of my 20-something friends have claimed. Pew Research data from 2019 found that 4 in 10 millennials don't identify with any religious affiliation. This was up nearly 20 percentage points from 7 years prior. A 2015 Harvard Divinity School study found that young people are still seeking both a deep spiritual experience and a community experience to imbue their lives with meaning, but fewer than ever are satisfying these desires with conventional faith. To classify this skyrocketing demographic of religious disaffiliates, scholars have come up with labels like the nuns and the remixed. The latter term was coined by Tara Isabella Burton, a theologian, reporter, and author of Strange Rites: New Religions for a Godless World. Remixed describes the tendency of contemporary seekers to mix and match beliefs and rituals from different circles, religious and secular, to come up with a bespoke spiritual routine. Say, a meditation class in the morning, horoscopes in the afternoon, and then ultra-reform Friday night Shabbat with friends. Spiritual meaning often doesn't involve God at all anymore. The Harvard Divinity School study named SoulCycle and CrossFit among the groups giving America's youth a modern religious identity. It gives you what religion gives you, which is the feeling that your life matters. Shawnee Green, a 26-year-old actress and die-hard soul cycler living in Los Angeles, told me of the exercise craze. The cynicism we have now is almost anti-human. We need to feel connected to something, like we're put on Earth for a reason other than just dying. At SoulCycle, for 45 minutes, I feel that. For those who bristle at the idea of comparing workout classes to religion, know that as tricky as it is to define cult, scholars have been arguing even harder for centuries over how to classify religion. You might have a feeling that Christianity is a religion, while fitness is not. But even experts have a tough time distinguishing exactly why. I like Burton's way of looking at it, which is less about what religions are and more about what religions do, which is to provide the following four things: meaning, purpose, a sense of community, and ritual. Less and less often are seekers finding these things at church. Modern cultish groups also feel comforting in part because they help alleviate the anxious mayhem of living in a world that presents almost too many possibilities for who to be, or at least the illusion of such. I once had a therapist tell me that flexibility without structure isn't flexibility at all. It's just chaos. That's how a lot of people's lives have been feeling. For most of America's history, there were comparatively few directions a person's career, hobbies, place of residence, romantic relationships, diet, aesthetic, everything could easily go in. But the 21st century presents folks, those of some privilege, that is, with a Cheesecake Factory-sized menu of decisions to make. The sheer quantity can be paralyzing, especially in an era of radical self-creation, when there's such pressure to craft a strong, personal brand, at the very same time that morale and basic survival feel more precarious for young people than they have in a long time. As our generational lore goes, millennials' parents told them they could grow up to be whatever they wanted. But then that cereal aisle of endless what-ifs and could-bes turned out to be so crushing, all they wanted was a guru to tell them which to pick. I want someone to tell me what to wear every morning. I want someone to tell me what to eat. Phoebe Waller-Bridge's 33-year-old character confesses to her priest, the hot one in season 2 of her Emmy-winning series Fleabag. What to hate, what to rage about, what to listen to, what band to like, what to buy tickets for, what to joke about, what not to joke about. I want someone to tell me what to believe in, who to vote for, who to love, and how to tell them. I just think I want someone to tell me how to live my life. Following a guru who provides an identity template, from one's politics to one's hairstyle, eases that chooser's paradox. This concept can be applied to spiritual extremists like Scientologists and 3HO members, but also to loyalists of social media celebrities and cult brands like Lululemon or Glossier. Just being able to say, I'm a Glossier girl, or I follow Dr. Joe Dispenza. A dubious self-help star we'll meet in part 6. Softens the burden and responsibility of having to make so many independent choices about what you think and who you are. It cuts the overwhelming number of answers you need to have down to a manageable few. You can simply ask, what would a Glossier girl do? And base your day's decisions, your perfume, your news sources, all of it, on that framework. The tide of change away from mainstream establishments and toward non-traditional groups is not at all new. It's something we've seen all over the world at several different junctures in human history. Society's attraction to so-called cults, both the propensity to join them and the anthropological fascination with them, tends to thrive during periods of broader existential questioning. Most alternative religious leaders come to power not to exploit their followers, but instead to guide them through social and political turbulence. Jesus of Nazareth, you may be familiar, arose during what is said to be the most fraught time in Middle Eastern history, a fact which speaks for itself. The violent, encroaching Roman Empire left people searching for a non-establishment guide who could inspire and protect them. 1,500 years later, during the tempestuous European Renaissance, dozens of cults cropped up in rebellion against the Catholic Church. In 17th century India, fringe groups grew out of the social discord that resulted from the shift to agriculture, and then as a reaction to British imperialism. Compared to other developed nations, the U.S. boasts a particularly consistent relationship with cults, which speaks to our brand of distinctly American tumult. Across the world, levels of religiosity tend to be lowest in countries with the highest standards of living. strong education levels, long life expectancies. But the US is exceptional in that it's both highly developed and full of believers, even with all our nones and remixed. This inconsistency can be explained in part because while citizens of other advanced nations, like Japan and Sweden, enjoy a bevy of top-down resources, including universal health care and all sorts of social safety nets, the US is more of a free-for-all. The Japanese and the Europeans know their governments will come to their aid in their hour of need, wrote Dr. David Ludden, a language psychologist at Georgia Gwinnett College for Psychology Today. But America's laissez-faire atmosphere makes people feel all on their own. Generation after generation, this lack of institutional support paves the way for alternative, supernaturally minded groups to surge. This pattern of American unrest was also responsible for the rise of cultish movements throughout the 1960s and 70s, when the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and both Kennedy assassinations knocked U.S. citizens unsteady. At the time, spiritual practice was spiking, but the overt reign of traditional Protestantism was declining. So new movements arose to quench that cultural thirst. These included everything from Christian offshoots like Jews for Jesus and the Children of God, to Eastern-derived fellowships like 3HO and Shambhala Buddhism, to pagan groups like the Covenant of the Goddess and the Church of Aphrodite, to sci-fi-esque ones like Scientology and Heaven's Gate. Some scholars now refer to this era as the Fourth Great Awakening. The first three were a string of zealous evangelical revivals that whirred through the American Northeast during the 1700s and 1800s. Different from the earlier Protestant awakenings, the fourth was populated by seekers looking toward the East and the occult to inspire individualistic quests for enlightenment. Just like 21st century cult followers, these seekers were mostly young, countercultural, politically divergent types who felt the powers that be had failed them. If you subscribe to an astrology app or have ever attended a music festival, odds are that in the 1970s, you'd have brushed up against a cult of some kind. Ultimately, the needs for identity, purpose, and belonging have existed for a very long time, and cultish groups have always sprung up during cultural limbos when these needs have gone sorely unmet. What's new is that in this internet-ruled age, when a guru can be godless, when the barrier to entry is as low as a double tap, and when folks who hold alternative beliefs are able to find one another more easily than ever, it only makes sense that secular cults, from obsessed workout studios to startups that put the cult in company culture, would start sprouting like dandelions. For good or for ill, there is now a cult for everyone. 4. A couple of years ago, amid a conversation about my decision in college to quit the competitive and quite cultish theater program at my university in favor of a linguistics major, my mother told me that my change of heart really came as no surprise to her, since she'd always considered me profoundly unculty. I chose to take this as a compliment, since I definitely wouldn't want to be characterized the opposite way, but it also didn't fully digest as praise. That's because, juxtaposed with the dark element, there's a certain sexiness surrounding cults, the unconventional aspect, the mysticism, the communal intimacy. In this way, the word has almost come full circle. Cult hasn't always carried ominous undertones. The earliest version of the term can be found in writings from the 17th century, when the cult label was much more innocent. Back then, it simply meant homage paid to divinity, or offerings made to win over the gods. The words culture and cultivation, derived from the same Latin verb cultus, are cult's close morphological cousins. The word evolved in the early 19th century, a time of experimental religious brouhaha in the United States. The American colonies, which were founded upon the freedom to practice new religions, gained a reputation as a safe haven where eccentric believers could get as freaky as they liked. This spiritual freedom opened the door for a stampede of alternative social and political groups, too. During the mid-1800s, well over 100 small ideological cliques formed and collapsed. When the French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville came to visit the U.S. in the 1830s, he was astonished by how Americans of all ages, all stations in life, and all types of disposition were forever forming associations. Cults of the time included groups like the Oneida Community, a camp of polyamorous communists in upstate New York. Sounds fun. The Harmony Society, an egalitarian fellowship of science lovers in Indiana. How lovely. And, my favorite, a short-lived vegan farming cult in Massachusetts called Fruitlands, which was founded by philosopher Amos Bronson Alcott, an abolitionist, women's rights activist, and father of Little Women author Louisa May Alcott. Back then, cult merely served as a sort of churchly classification, alongside religion and sect. The word denoted something new or unorthodox, but not necessarily nefarious. The term started gaining its darker reputation toward the start of the Fourth Great Awakening. That's when the emergence of so many nonconformist spiritual groups spooked old-school conservatives and Christians. Cults soon became associated with charlatans, quacks, and heretical kooks. But they still weren't considered much of a societal threat or criminal priority. Not until the Manson family murders of 1969, followed by the Jonestown massacre of 1978, which we'll investigate in part 2. After that, the word cult became a symbol of fear. The grisly death of over 900 people at Jonestown, the largest number of American civilian casualties prior to 9/11, sent the whole country into cult delirium. Some readers may recall the subsequent Satanic Panic, a period in the 80s defined by widespread paranoia that Satan-worshipping child abusers were terrorizing wholesome American neighborhoods. As sociologist Ron Enroth wrote in his 1979 book, The Lure of the Cults, the unprecedented media exposure given Jonestown alerted Americans to the fact that seemingly beneficent religious groups can mask a hellish rot. Then, as these things tend to go, as soon as cults became frightening, they also became cool. 70s pop culture didn't wait long to birth terms like cult film and cult classic, which describes the up-and-coming genre of underground indie movies like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Bands like Phish and the Grateful Dead came to be known for their peripatetic cult followings. A generation or two after the Fourth Great Awakening, the era began to take on a nostalgic cool factor among cult-curious youth. Fringe groups from the 70s now boast a sort of perversely stylish vintage cachet. At this point, being obsessed with the Manson family is akin to having an extensive collection of hippie-era vinyl and band tees. At an LA salon the other week, I eavesdropped on a woman telling her stylist that she was going for a Manson girl hair look. Overgrown, brunette, middle-parted. A 20-something acquaintance of mine recently hosted a cult-themed birthday party in New York's Hudson Valley, the site of numerous historical cults, including the Family, Nexium, and countless witches, as well as the Woodstock Music Festival. There are several cultish groups who hide behind the vague moniker, the Family. This one was a 60s-born New Age doomsday commune run by a sadistic Australian yoga instructor named Anne Hamilton Byrne, who, common story, claimed messiah status and was busted in the late 80s for kidnapping over a dozen children and abusing them in aberrant ways, like forcing them to take ritualistic heaps of LSD. The dress code? All white. Filtered photographs of guests sporting ivory slips and glassy-eyed, "Oops, I didn't know I was haunted" expressions flooded my Instagram feed. Over the decades, the word cult has become so sensationalized, so romanticized that most experts I spoke to don't even use it anymore. Their stance is that the meaning of cult is too broad and subjective to be useful, at least in academic literature. As recently as the 1990s, scholars had no problem tossing around the term to describe any group considered by many to be deviant. But it doesn't take a social scientist to see the bias built into that categorization. A few scholars have tried to get more precise and identify specific cult criteria. Charismatic leaders, mind-altering behaviors, sexual and financial exploitation, an us versus them mentality toward non-members, and an ends justify the means philosophy. Stephen Kent, a sociology professor at the University of Alberta, adds that cult has typically been applied to groups that have some degree of supernatural beliefs, though that isn't always the case. Angels and demons don't usually make their way into, say, cosmetics pyramid schemes, except when they do. More on that in part 4. But Kent says the result of all these institutions is the same: a power imbalance built on members' devotion, hero worship, and absolute trust, which frequently facilitates abuse on the part of unaccountable leaders. The glue that keeps this trust intact is members' belief that their leaders have a rare access to transcendent wisdom, which allows them to exercise control over their systems of rewards and punishments, both here on Earth and in the afterlife. Based on my conversations, these qualities seem to encapsulate what many everyday folks view as a real cult, or the academic definition of a cult. But as it turns out, cult doesn't have an official academic definition, because it's inherently pejorative, Rebecca Moore, a religion professor at San Diego State University, clarified during a phone interview. It's simply used to describe groups we don't like. Moore comes to the subject of cults from a unique place. Her 2 sisters were among those who perished in the Jonestown massacre. In fact, Jim Jones enlisted them to help pull off the event. But Moore told me she doesn't use the word cult in earnest because it's become inarguably judgment-laden. As soon as someone says it, we know as readers, listeners, or individuals exactly what we should think about that particular group, she explained. Equally, brainwashing is a term that is tossed around incessantly by the media, but that almost every expert I consulted for this book either avoids or rejects. We don't say that soldiers are brainwashed to kill other people. That's basic training, offers Moore. We don't say that fraternity members are brainwashed to haze their pledges. That's peer pressure. Here's a fun little story. In 1959, a Southern California cult conducted an unusual initiation ceremony. Men who wished to be part of the Klan had to prove their devotion by ingesting a nightmarish buffet of pig's head, fresh brains, and raw liver. In his attempts to complete the challenge, one young recruit named Richard kept vomiting up the concoction, but desperate for acceptance, he eventually forced it down. Promptly, a hulking mass of liver became wedged in his windpipe, and he choked on it. By the time he reached the hospital, he was dead. But no criminal charges were ever filed because this wasn't actually a cult. It was a fraternity at USC enacting just one of countless pledge-hazing rituals, which are often far more disgusting, outlandish, and deadly, and involve more vomit and other bodily fluids than anything you'll find in most alternative religions. Most of us tend to take brainwashing literally, imagining that some neurological rewiring occurs during cult indoctrinations. But brainwashing is a metaphor. There is nothing objective about it. Moore would be the perfect candidate to believe in literal brainwashing, considering her 2 sisters' role in the Jonestown tragedy. But she still refutes the concept because, for one, it disregards people's very real ability to think for themselves. Human beings are not helpless drones whose decision-making skills are so fragile that they can be wiped clean at any time. If brainwashing were real, says Moore, we would expect to see many more dangerous people running around, planning to carry out reprehensible schemes. Simply put, you cannot force someone to believe something they absolutely do not on any level want to believe by using some set of evil techniques to wash their brain. Secondly, Moore argues, brainwashing presents an untestable hypothesis. For a theory to meet the standard criteria of the scientific method, it has to be controvertible. That is, it must be possible to prove the thing false. For example, as soon as objects start traveling faster than the speed of light, we'll know that Einstein got his theory of special relativity wrong. But you can't prove that brainwashing doesn't exist. The minute you say someone is brainwashed, the conversation ends there. No room is left to explore what might actually be motivating the person's behavior, which, as it turns out, is a much more interesting question. When tossed around to describe everyone from a political candidate's supporters to militant vegans, the terms cult and brainwashing acquire a sort of armchair therapist éclat. We all love a chance to feel psychologically and morally superior without having to think about why. And calling a whole bunch of people brainwashed cult followers does just that. This negative bias is detrimental because not all cults are depraved or perilous. Statistically, in fact, few of them are. Barker, our London School of Economics sociologist, says that out of the 1,000+ alternative groups she's documented that have been or could be described as cults, the vast majority have not been involved with criminal activity of any kind. Moore and Barker note that fringe communities only gain publicity when they do something awful, like Heaven's Gate and Jonestown. And even those groups didn't set out with murder and mayhem in mind. After all, Jonestown started out as an integrationist church. Things escalated as Jones grew hungrier for power, but most cults never spiral as catastrophically as his did. A feedback loop of scandal is created. Only the most destructive cults gain attention, so we come to think of all cults as destructive, and we simultaneously only recognize the destructive ones as cults, so those gain more attention, reinforcing their negative reputation, and so on ad infinitum. Equally troubling is the fact that the word cult has so frequently been used as permission to trash religions that society just doesn't approve of. So many of today's longest-standing religious denominations, Catholics, Baptists, Mormons, Quakers, Jews, and most Native American religions, to name a few, were once considered unholy blasphemies in the United States. And this was a nation founded on religious freedom. Today, American alternative religions, oppressive and not, from Jehovah's Witnesses to Wiccans, are widely regarded as cults. The Chinese government insistently decries the cultish evils of new religion Falun Gong, despite its peaceful tenets, which include patience and compassion through meditation. Barker has noted that official reports out of majority Catholic Belgium condemn the Quakers, just about the chillest religion ever, as a cult, or sect, actually, as the word cult in French has held on to its neutral connotations. Throughout the world, cultural normativity still has so much to do with the religious group's perceived legitimacy, no matter if its teachings are any weirder or more harmful than a better established group. After all, what nature spiritual leader doesn't have some trace of blood on their hands? As the religion scholar Reza Aslan famously stated, the biggest joke in religious studies is that cult plus time equals religion. In the U.S., Mormonism and Catholicism have been around long enough that they've been given our stamp of approval. Having earned the status of religion, they enjoy a certain amount of common respect and, importantly, protection under the Constitution's First Amendment. Because of this protection variable, labeling something a cult becomes not just a value judgment, but an arbiter of real life or death consequences. To quote Megan Goodwin, a researcher of American alternative religions at Northeastern University, the political ramifications of identifying something as a cult are real and often violent. What did these ramifications look like? Dig no deeper than Jonestown. Once the press identified Jonestown's victims as cultists, they were instantly relegated to a subclass of human. This made it easier for the public to distance themselves from the tragedy and its victims, dismissing them as weak, gullible, unsuited to life, and unworthy of post-mortem respect, wrote Laura Elizabeth Woolett, author of the Jonestown-inspired novel Beautiful Revolutionary. Bodies weren't autopsied. Families were denied the timely return of their relatives' remains. Perhaps the most significant fiasco that resulted from demonizing cult followers was the case of the Branch Davidians, the victims of the notorious Waco siege of 1993. Founded in 1959, the Branch Davidians were a religious movement descended from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. At its peak in the early 1990s, the group had about 100 members, who lived together on a settlement in Waco, Texas, preparing for the second coming of Jesus Christ under the abusive governance of David Koresh, who claimed to be a prophet, as solipsistic new religious leaders often do. Reasonably perturbed and in urgent need of help, followers' families tipped off the FBI, who in February 1993 seized the Branch Davidian compound. Several dozen agents arrived, armed with rifles, tanks, and tear gas, to save the brainwashed cult followers. But the invasion didn't go to plan. Instead, it led to a 51-day standoff, which ended only after a few hundred more FBI agents showed up and used tear gas to flush their targets out of hiding. In the mayhem, a fire broke out, resulting in the deaths of nearly 80 Branch Davidians. Koresh was not innocent in all this. He was maniacal and violent, and his stubbornness was part of what led to so many casualties. But so was the fear surrounding the word cult. If the FBI had applied such excessive violence to a more socially accepted religion, one that benefited from the First Amendment safeguard, there likely would have been much more of an uproar. Their attack on the Branch Davidian base, by contrast, was both legally sanctioned and socially condoned. Religion is a constitutionally protected category, and the identification of Waco's Branch Davidians as a cult places them outside the protections of the state, explains Catherine Westinger, a religion scholar at Loyola University in New Orleans. The FBI may have gone to save the Branch Davidians, but when they killed them instead, few Americans cared, because they weren't a church, they were a cult. Alas, the semantics of sanctimony. In a classic 1999 study, the famous Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura revealed that when human subjects were labeled with dehumanizing language, such as animals, participants were more willing to harm them by administering electric shocks. It seems that the cult label can serve a similar function. This is not to say that some groups that have been or could be called cults aren't hazardous. Certainly, plenty of them are. Instead, because the word cult is so emotionally charged and up for interpretation, the label itself does not provide enough information for us to determine if a group is dangerous. We have to look more carefully. We have to be more specific. In an attempt to find a less judgy way to discuss non-mainstream spiritual communities, many scholars have used neutral-sounding labels like new religious movements, emergent religions, and marginalized religions. But while these phrases work in an academic context, I find they don't quite capture the Crossfits, multi-level marketing companies, college theater programs, and other hard-to-categorize points along the influence continuum. We need a more versatile way to talk about communities that are cult-like in one way or another, but not necessarily connected to the supernatural, which is why I like the word cultish. 5. I grew up entranced by all things cult, mostly because of my father. As a kid, he was forced to join one. In 1969, when my dad, Craig Montell, was 14, His absentee father and stepmother decided they wanted in on the blossoming countercultural movement. So, they moved young Craig and his two toddler-age half-sisters onto a remote socialist commune outside San Francisco called Synanon. In the late 1950s, Synanon started as a rehabilitation center for hard drug users, labeled dope fiends, but later extended to accommodate non-drug addicted lifestylers. In Synanon, children lived in barracks miles away from their parents, and no one was allowed to work or go to school on the outside. Some members were forced to shave their heads. Many married couples were separated and assigned new partners. But everyone on the Synanon settlement, no exceptions, had to play the game. The game was a ritualistic activity where every evening, members were divided into small circles and subjected to hours of vicious personal criticism by their peers. This practice was the centerpiece of Synanon. In fact, life there was divided into two semantic categories: in the game and out of the game. These confrontations were presented as group therapy, but really, they were a form of social control. There was nothing fun about the game, which could be hostile or humiliating, yet it was referred to as something you played. It turns out that this type of extreme truth-telling activity is not uncommon in cultish groups. Jim Jones hosted similar events called family meetings or catharsis meetings, where followers would all gather in the mother church on Wednesday nights. During these meetings, anyone who had offended the group in some way was called to the floor so their family and friends could malign them to prove their greater loyalty to the cause. More on all that in part 2. I cut my teeth on Synanon tales from my father, who escaped at 17 and went on to become a prolific neuroscientist. Now, his very job is to ask hard questions and seek proof at every turn. My dad was always so generous with his storytelling, indulging my wide-eyed curiosity by repeating the same stories of Synanon's dismal living quarters and conformist milieu, of the biologist he met there who tasked him with running the commune's medical lab at age 15. While his peers outside Synanon were fretting over puppy love squabbles and SAT prep, my dad was culturing followers' throat swabs and testing food handlers' fingertips for tuberculosis microbes. The lab was a sanctuary for my dad, a rare space on Synanon's grounds where the rules of empirical logic applied. Paradoxically, it's where he found his love of science. Hungry for an education outside the commune's closed system, and desperate for a legitimate diploma that would allow him to attend college, when he wasn't in a white coat or playing the game, he was sneaking off the settlement to attend an accredited high school in San Francisco, the only Synanon child to do so. He stayed quiet, flew under the radar, and privately interrogated everything. Even when I was a little kid, what always gripped me most about my dad's Synanon stories was the group's special language. Terms like in the game and out of the game. Love match, meaning Synanon marriages. Act as if, an imperative never to question Synanon's protocols, to simply act as if you agreed until you did. Demonstrators and PODs, parents on duty, the rotation of adults randomly selected to chaperone the children's school and barracks, and so many more. This curious lingo was the clearest window into that world. As the daughter of scientists, I figure some combination of nature, nurture, and Synanon stories caused me to become a rather incredulous person, and since early childhood, I have always been keenly sensitive to cultish-sounding rhetoric, but also beguiled by its power. In middle school, my best friend's mother was a born-again Christian, and I'd sometimes secretly skip Hebrew school on Sundays to accompany the family to their evangelical megachurch. Nothing enraptured me more than the way these churchgoers spoke. How, upon setting foot in the building, everyone slipped into a dialect of evangelicalese. It wasn't King James Bible English. It was modern and very distinct. I started using their glossary of buzzwords whenever I attended services, just to see if it affected how the congregants treated me. Picked up phrases like, on my heart, a synonym for on my mind. Love up on someone, to show someone love. In the Word, reading the Bible. Father of lies, Satan, the evil that governs the world. And convicted, to be divinely moved to do something. It was like the code language of an exclusive clubhouse. Though these special terms didn't communicate anything that couldn't be said in plain English, using them in the right way at the right time was like a key unlocking the group's acceptance. Immediately, I was perceived as an insider. The language was a password, a disguise, a truth serum. It was so powerful. Creating special language to influence people's behavior and beliefs is so effective in part simply because speech is the first thing we're willing to change about ourselves, and also the last thing we let go. Unlike shaving your head, relocating to a commune, or even changing your clothes, adopting new terminology is instant and seemingly commitment-free. Let's say you show up to a spiritual meeting out of curiosity, and the host starts off by asking the group to repeat a chant. Odds are, you do it. Maybe it feels odd and peer pressure-y at first, but they didn't ask you to fork over your life savings or kill anyone. How much damage can it do? Cultish language works so efficiently and invisibly to mold our worldview in the shape of the gurus that once it's embedded, it sticks. After you grow your hair out, move back home, delete the app, whatever it is, the special vocabulary is still there. In part 2 of this book, we'll meet a man named Frank Lyford, a survivor of the 1990s suicide cult, Heaven's Gate, who, 25 years after defecting and disowning its belief system, still calls his 2 former leaders by their monastic names, T and Do, refers to the group as the classroom, and describes its members' haunting fate with the euphemism leaving Earth, just as he was taught to do over 2 decades ago. The idea to write this book occurred to me after my best friend from college decided to quit drinking and go to Alcoholics Anonymous. She lived 3,000 miles away from me at the time, so I only saw her a few times a year, and from afar, I couldn't tell how committed she was to this no drinking thing, or really what to make of it. That is, until the first time I went to visit her after she got sober. That night, we were having trouble figuring out dinner plans when the following sentence exited her mouth. I've been halting all day. I caught a resentment at work, but trying not to future trip. Ugh, let's just focus on dinner. First things first, as they say. I must have looked at her as if she had 3 heads. Halt? Future trip? Caught a resentment? What on earth was she saying? I'd quickly learn that HALT stands for hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. Future tripping is stressing out over potential events you can't control. Caught a resentment means to be overcome by disdain for someone, and first things first is a self-proclaimed AA cliche that means just what it sounds like. Admittedly, these are extremely useful mottos, as are most of the zingers in AA's clever lexicon. 3 months in AA, and this person who was so close to me I could have accurately distinguished the meanings of her different exhalations was suddenly speaking a foreign language. Instantly, I had a heuristic reaction. It was the same instinct I felt looking at those old photos of Tasha Samar in the desert, the same response my dad had the day he first stepped onto Synanon's grounds. The Jonestown survivor once told me, they say that a cult is like pornography. You know it when you see it. Or if you're like me, you know it when you hear it. Exclusive language was the biggest clue. AA wasn't Synanon, of course. It was changing my friend's life for the better. But its conquest of her vocabulary was impossible to unhear. Instincts aren't social science, though. And in truth, I didn't actually know AA was a cult. But I had a strong inkling that there was something mighty and mysterious going on there. I had to look deeper. I had to understand. How did the group's language take such rapid hold of my friend? How does language work, for better and for worse, to make people submerge themselves in zealous ideological groups with unchecked leaders? How does it keep them in the whirlpool? I began this project out of the perverse craving for cult campfire tales that so many of us possess. But it quickly became clear that learning about the connections across language, power, community, and belief could legitimately help us understand what motivates people's fanatical behaviors during this ever-restless era, a time when we find multi-level marketing scams masquerading as feminist startups, phony shamans ballyhooing bad health advice, online hate groups radicalizing new members, and kids sending each other literal death threats in defense of their favorite brands. Shani, the 26-year-old soul cycler, told me she once saw one teenager pull a weapon on another over the last pair of sneakers at an LA hypebeast sample sale. The next crusades will be not religious, but consumerist, she suggested. Uber versus Lyft, Amazon versus Amazon boycotters, TikTok versus Instagram. Tara Isabella Burton put it well when she said, "If the boundaries between cult and religion are already slippery, those between religion and culture are more porous still." The haunting, beautiful, stomach-twisting truth is that no matter how cult-phobic you fancy yourself, our participation in things is what defines us. Whether you were born into a family of Pentecostals who speak in tongues, left home at 18 to join the Kundalini yogis, got dragged into a soul-sucking startup right out of college, became an AA regular last year, or just 5 seconds ago, clicked a targeted ad promoting not just a skincare product, but the priceless opportunity to become part of a movement, group affiliation, which can have profound, even eternal significance, make up the scaffolding upon which we build our lives. It doesn't take someone broken or disturbed to crave that structure. Again, we're wired to. And what we often overlook is that the material with which that scaffolding is built, the very material that fabricates our reality, is language. We've always used language to explain what we already knew, wrote English scholar Gary Eberly in his 2007 book, Dangerous Words. But more importantly, we've also used it to reach toward what we did not yet know or understand. With words, we breathe reality into being. A linguistic concept called the theory of performativity says that language does not simply describe or reflect who we are, it creates who we are. That's because speech itself has the capacity to consummate actions, thus exhibiting a level of intrinsic power. The plainest examples of performative language would be making a promise, performing a wedding ceremony, or pronouncing a legal sentence. When repeated over and over again, speech has meaningful, consequential power to construct and constrain our reality. Ideally, most people's understandings of reality are shared and grounded in logic. But to enmesh in a community that uses linguistic rituals, chants, prayers, turns of phrase, to reshape that culture of shared understanding Eileen Barker spoke of, can draw us away from the real world. Without us even noticing, our very understanding of ourselves and what we believe to be true becomes bound up with the group, with the leader, all because of language. This book will explore the wide spectrum of cults and their uncanny lexicons, starting with the most famously, blatantly dreadful ones, and working its way to communities so seemingly innocuous we might not even notice how cultish they are. In order to keep the scope of these stories manageable, because goodness knows I could spend my whole life interviewing people about cults of all kinds, we're going to focus mainly on American groups. Each part of the book will focus on a different category of cult, all the while exploring the cultish rhetoric that imbues our everyday lives. Part 2 is dedicated to notorious suicide cults, like Jonestown and Heaven's Gate. Part 3 explores controversial religions like Scientology and Children of God. Part 4 is about multi-level marketing companies, MLMs. Part 5 covers cult fitness studios, and Part 6 delves into social media gurus. The words we hear and use every day can provide clues to help us determine which groups are healthy, which are toxic, and which are a little bit of both, and to what extent we wish to engage with them. Within these pages lies an adventure into the curious and curiously familiar language of cultish. So, in the words of many a cult leader, come along, follow me. Part 2. Congratulations! You have been chosen to join the next evolutionary level above human. 1. Drinking the Kool-Aid. This is a phrase you know. Having taken a seat at the table of everyday idioms, it's probably come up on at least a few dozen occasions over the course of your English-speaking life. The last time I overheard the expression was only about a week ago, as I caught someone casually describe their allegiance to Sweetgreen, the trendy chopped salad chain. I guess I've just drunk the Kool-Aid, they said with a side smile, taking their quinoa to go. I, too, once uttered this remark just as reflexively as any other familiar stock saying, speak of the devil, hit the nail on the head, can't judge a book by its cover. But that was before I knew the stories. Today, drinking the Kool-Aid is most often used to describe someone mindlessly following a majority, or as shorthand for questioning their sanity. In 2012, Forbes christened it a top annoying cliche used by business leaders. Bill O'Reilly has invoked the saying to write off his critics. The Kool-Aid people are going nuts, he's told listeners. I've even found it in contexts as glib and self-deprecating as, yeah, I finally bought a Peloton. I guess I drank the Kool-Aid. Or, he's obsessed with Radiohead. He drank the Kool-Aid back in the 90s. And then, of course, the Sweetgreen thing. Most speakers use the idiom without batting an eye, but there are a select few who grasp its gravity. One of the most vile phrases in the English language is how 71-year-old Tim Carter describes it. Tim told me this on a long call from San Francisco, talking a mile a minute as if he couldn't get his repugnance out fast enough. People have no idea what they're even saying. Decades ago, an old neighbor of Tim's named Odell Rhodes voiced the same sentiment in an expose for the Washington Post. The whole drinking the Kool-Aid thing is so odious, so completely wrong. Terry Buford O'Shea, a 67-year-old poet who once knew both Tim and Odell, made a similar comment on the phrase. It makes me shudder. Tim, Odell, and Terry have a unique perspective on drinking the Kool-Aid, because in the 1970s, they were all members of the People's Temple. The group went by many names: a congregation, a movement, a lifestyle, an agricultural project, an experiment, a promised land. This was not unintentional. Shadowy groups are expert rebranders, benefiting from the confusion, distraction, and secrecy a revolving door of puzzling new labels can incite. The People's Temple started as a racially integrated church in Indianapolis in the 1950s. A decade later, it moved to Northern California, where it evolved to become more of a progressive, socio-political movement. That's according to the FBI reports. But it wasn't until 1974, when the People's Temple relocated to a remote stretch of land in South America, that it became the cult known as Jonestown. Mythologized by many, but understood by few, Jonestown was an arid 3,800-acre settlement in northwestern Guyana that housed about 1,000 occupants at the time of its denouement in 1978. The place was named after its inglorious leader, Jim Jones. He also went by many names. In Indianapolis, when the group still had religious leanings, followers addressed Jones as God or Father. Father's Day was celebrated on May 13th, his birthday. By the time the group reached Guyana and secularized, his moniker evolved to the cozier Dad. Eventually, members also started calling him the office, by way of metonymy, like how a king might be referred to as the crown. And in his later years, Jones insisted on the courtly title founder leader. Jones moved his followers from Redwood City, California to Guyana, promising a socialist paradise outside the evils of what he saw as an encroaching fascist apocalypse in the United States. Grainy film prints of the place depict a veritable Eden. Children of all races blissfully play as their parents braid each other's hair and befriend the neighboring wildlife. In one image, a 25-year-old woman named Maria Katsaris, one of Jones's lovers and a member of his innermost circle, grins while placing a genial index finger on the tip of a toucan's beak. Scrap the historical context, and it looks like the sort of humble, off-the-grid Elysium where I could have seen any number of my progressive LA pals going to escape the Trump administration. A pet toucan sounds nice. Today, most Americans have at least heard of Jonestown, if not the name, then the iconography. A commune in the jungle, a manic preacher, poisoned punch, corpses piled in the grass. Jonestown is best known for the mass murder-suicide of over 900 followers on November 18, 1978. Most of the victims, including more than 300 children, met their fate after consuming a lethal concoction of cyanide and trace amounts of tranquilizers, which were mixed into vats of grape-flavored juice made from the powdered fruit concentrate Flavor-Aid. Drinking the Kool-Aid is a metaphor derived from this tragedy. Our culture erroneously remembers the elixir as Kool-Aid, not Flavor-Aid, due to the former's status as a genericized trademark, like how some people call all tissues Kleenex, even though there are also Puffs and Angel Soft. The Jonestownians died by the cheaper shelf brand version, which they ingested, most orally, some by injection, and many against their will, under extreme pressure from Jones, who claimed revolutionary suicide was their only option for protesting the conditions of an inhumane world. Folks didn't go to Guyana to die a bizarre death. They went in search of a better life, to try socialism on for size, or because their churches back home were failing, or to evade the racist American police. Sound familiar? With the Promised Land, Jim Jones guaranteed a solution for every walk of life. And with all the right words delivered just so, people had reason to believe him. Jones, whose character alone has been the subject of several dozen books, made famous what are now recognized as all the classic red flags of a dangerous guru. On the surface, he seemed a prophetic political revolutionary, but underneath, he was a maniacal, lying, paranoid narcissist. As the story tends to go, his devotees didn't find that out until it was too late. In the beginning, more than one survivor swore to me, there seemed nothing not to love. Born and raised in Indiana, Jim Jones was a promising new pastor in his 20s when he created his first congregation there. A rock-ribbed integrationist, he and his wife were the first white couple in the state to adopt a black child, and they soon filled their home with many other non-white kids. Jones called his household the Rainbow Family, which sent a message that he walked the walk of racial justice not only at church, but in his personal life too. Jones's image wasn't just progressive and pious, though. He was handsome too, an Elvis doppelganger in his youth. Personally, I don't see the appeal. Unpopular opinion, I guess, but Jones's blocky, cartoonish features have always reminded me a little of Biff Tannen, the bully from Back to the Future. I suppose deranged murderers might just not be my type, though I know that hybristophilia, an attraction to brutish criminals, is a very real thing. Jones, Ted Bundy, and Charles Manson all had groupies. Even the famous psychologist Philip Zimbardo, the guy known for the Stanford prison experiment, openly commented on Jones's irresistible sexual appeal. But sex appeal isn't just looks. It's an ability to craft the illusion of intimacy between yourself and your fans. That's what Jonestown expats remember. Each one I spoke to rhapsodized about the man's impossible charm, his knack for seamlessly relating to anyone, from white upper-middle-class bohemians to black folks active in the church. With 20-something San Francisco progressives, Jones waxed socialist, seducing them with professorial Nietzsche quotes. With older Pentecostals, he used Bible verses and the familiar timbre of a reverend. Multiple survivors told me that the first time they spoke to Jones, it felt as if he had known them their whole lives, that he spoke their language. This kind of intense validation, later traded for control, is what some social scientists term love bombing. He appealed to anyone on any level at any time, explained Leslie Wagner Wilson, a public speaker, memoirist, and survivor of Jonestown. He could quote scripture and turn around and preach socialism. Leslie didn't just live to tell the tale of Jonestown. The morning of the massacre, she escaped by darting into the jungle. At just 22, a young black woman with round glasses and cherubic cheeks, Leslie trekked 30 miles through the gnarled vegetation, her 3-year-old son strapped to her back with a bedsheet. Her mother, sister, brother, and husband did not survive. Flashback 9 years. Leslie was in junior high when her mother, who was raising a house full of kids on her own and searching for support, joined the People's Temple in Redwood City. Since she was 13 years old, the People's Temple was Leslie's whole world. Jones was father and dad to her. He called her his little Angela Davis. Talk about love bombing. For the teenager whose identity was still forming, a comparison to the radical activist and role model strengthened her trust in Jones. Every time he used the nickname, it reinforced that commitment. Ever the savvy showman, Jones successfully manipulated the revolutionary aspirations of young African Americans reeling from the fading promise of the Black Power movement, wrote Sakibu Hutchinson, feminist author of White Knights, Black Paradise. Naturally, Leslie wanted to believe she was the next Angela Davis. She was understandably motivated to think she could offer her community that kind of hope. In this way, it wasn't Jones's looks, family optics, or even his ideas that hooked people. It was his way with words. The way that he spoke, he was a great orator, said Leslie. It moved you. It inspired you. I was just enthralled. Jones didn't convince all the people Leslie loved, bright family-oriented folks who objectively had nothing in common with the guy, to follow him to the ends of the earth using some form of cryptic mind magic. It was with language, another Jonestown survivor told me fervently. That's how he gained and kept control. Boasting the intonation and passion of a Baptist preacher, the complex theorizings of an Aristotelian philosopher, the folksy wit of a countryside fabler, and the ferocious zeal of a demented tyrant, Jim Jones was a linguistic chameleon who possessed a monster arsenal of shrewd rhetorical strategies, which he wielded to attract and condition followers of all stripes. This is what the most cunning cultish leaders do. Instead of sticking to one unchanging lexis to represent a unified doctrine, they customize their language according to the individual in front of them. Known for quotes like, "Socialism is older than the Bible by far," and "A capitalist mentality is the lowest vibration at which one could operate in this already dense plane of existence," Jones's Frankensteinian oratory often referenced political theory and metaphysics in the same breath. His vocabulary could change quickly from being rather backwoods and homey to being quite intellectual, recalled Gary Lambrev, a poet and People's Temple vet from back in its Redwood City days. He had an enormous vocabulary. He read an unbelievable amount. I don't know where he found the time. A quick-changing vocabulary used for social capital. A linguist might tell you Jones was a sly practitioner of code switching, or fluidly alternating between multiple language varieties. Among the non-diabolical, code switching is an efficient, and usually unconscious, way of using every linguistic resource at your disposal to handle a verbal exchange most effectively. One might code switch between dialects or languages from one setting to the next, or even within a single conversation, to express a specific mood, emphasize a statement, adapt to a social convention, or communicate a certain identity. The stakes of code switching can be as high as ensuring respect and even survival, as is the case for speakers of certain marginalized ethnolects, like African American English, who learn to shift to Standard English in settings where they could be judged or persecuted otherwise. And then, in a kind of opposite way, code switching can be used to connivingly gain trust. This was Jim Jones's specialty. Like a Machiavellian version of my 12-year-old self slipping into evangelicalese at my friend's megachurch, Jones learned how to meet each follower on their linguistic level, which sent an instant signal that he understood them and their backgrounds uniquely. Starting early in life, Jones carefully studied the speech stylings of compelling populist pastors and politicians, from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Father Divine, a Black spiritual leader and mentor to Jones, to Hitler. He stole the best bits and added his own Jonesian twist. He learned to modulate his voice in the manner of a Pentecostal preacher and picked up phrases that white people weren't supposed to know, like Jack White preachers, an in-group label used in some Black church groups to criticize scammy white televangelists. By the time the People's Temple reached Guyana, it had become about 3/4 African American, although Jones's inner circle was almost entirely young white women, like Maria Katsaris, which is a pattern in power abuse. An older man at the top, and by his side, a clique of fair-skinned 20 and 30-something women who acquiesced to exchanging their whiteness and sexuality for a few more grains of power. By invoking politicized buzzwords like bourgeois bitches, the term Jones coined to forbid white followers from attending certain meetings, and churchianity, a portmanteau condemning phony white Christians, Jones created the illusion that the Black majority had more privilege than they did. He would visit Black churches, stand at the back door, and look at the preacher, who had mesmerized a crowd of 100 people, recalled Jonestown survivor Laura Johnston Cole. At 72 years old, Laura sports a fair sloping face and inch-long silver hair, but the same hopeful eyes that met Jim Jones's 5 decades ago and thought, this man is onto something great. In retrospect, of course, she sees him more clearly. Jim didn't care about religion. He studied those people because he thought, that's the job I want, and more. Laura Johnston Cole found the People's Temple as a 22-year-old civil rights demonstrator. Born to a progressive, politically active single mom in a still segregated D.C. suburb, she grew up witnessing racial injustice all around her. Laura dropped out of college in 1968 and moved to California to pursue activism full-time. I wanted to live in a community that was a mix of all races, all financial levels, all economic levels. I joined People's Temple for the political part, Laura told me on one of our many phone calls. She longed for societal equality and was down to get experimental to find it. Jones's plans for a rural settlement overseas made her pupils dilate with possibility. She packed a single duffel bag and moved to Guyana eagerly. Laura lived to tell her story because on the day of the massacre, she wasn't in Jonestown. She was one of a lucky few who'd been sent to Georgetown, Guyana's capital, on an assignment. Laura was tasked with greeting Congressman Leo Ryan, a California rep who'd come to investigate Jonestown, having caught word from members' families that the place was suspicious. Still an enthusiastic People's Temple loyalist, Laura was sure to make a good impression. 150 miles east of Jonestown, she missed the carnage entirely. You'd think narrowly escaping such an event might turn one off to remote utopias. But 2 years later, in 1980, Laura joined another one, Synanon, the very same group my dad had escaped 8 years before. Her involvement in 2 infamous cults notwithstanding, Laura seemed totally level-headed when we spoke. Energetic and curious, she reminded me of half the girls I went to liberal arts college with. She spoke of her childhood as a popular girl, her well-adjusted family, her days hosting Black Panther meetings in her kitchen, her love for communal living. In the 70s, we had a saying, one person can only whisper. You need to be in a group to stand strong, Laura told me. So, when she moved to San Francisco in her early 20s and met a passionate organizer named Jim, who told her he detested white supremacy and wanted to create a socialist haven outside of it, she thought, where do I sign? Never did she predict her political hero would murder all her friends under the guise of revolutionary suicide. This term is one of many Jones distorted in order to emotionally wrangle his followers. Revolutionary suicide was, in fact, the very last phrase he uttered before their deaths. Coined by Black Panther Party leader Huey Newton in the late 1960s, revolutionary suicide initially described the act of a demonstrator dying at the hands of their oppressor. The idea was that if you took to the streets to protest the man might shoot you down, but the rebel behind you would pick up the banner and keep going. They might get shot down too, but the movement would continue until one day one of your successors would carry that banner all the way to freedom. Revolutionary suicide, as Newton meant it, was a phrase most People's Temple followers could get on board with. So Jones slowly perverted it, using it in various contexts depending on what he wanted out of them. On some occasions, Jones described revolutionary suicide as an appropriate alternative to being taken prisoner or being enslaved by the man. Other times he used it to describe the act of walking into a crowd of enemies wearing a bomb and detonating it. But most famously, Jones invoked the phrase on the day of the massacre, framing death for his followers as a political statement against the hidden rulers, evil secret heads of government, rather than a coerced fate they had no say in. By March 18, 1978, many of Jones's followers had already lost faith in him. His mental and physical health had long been in decline. He'd been abusing a cocktail of pharmaceuticals and suffered from a host of medical ailments, which are hard to keep track of, since he exaggerated and lied about a great many of them, including telling acolytes he had lung cancer and then curing himself of it. Not to mention Jonestown's brutal living conditions. As it turned out, the promised land followers expected to find in Guyana was not conducive to growing crops. Children were starving, and their parents were brutally overworked, sleep-deprived, and desperate to leave. That's why Congressman Ryan came to town. Having received tips from followers' families that they were being held captive against their will, Ryan decided to fly down and check in, and he brought a few reporters and some delegates along with him. Jones, impresario that he was, did everything to conceal the rotten truth of the place while putting on a show for the congressman. A lavish dinner, confident banter, but Jones knew there was no way they'd let him off the hook. At the end of the visit, Ryan and his crew returned to the small Jonestown airstrip to leave, and several residents followed them, trying to escape. Jones had ordered his militia to tail the defectors, and as soon as they began to board, thinking they were in the clear, the squad turned on them. They opened fire and killed 5 people, 1 Jonestown defector, 3 journalists, and Congressman Ryan. This event sparked the infamous suicide. Contrary to popular belief, the tragedy wasn't premeditated, at least not how the press painted it to be, and most of its victims did not die voluntarily. Popular Jonestown coverage spun a story that Jones regularly hosted ghoulish suicide rehearsals known as White Nights, where his mind-controlled minions would line up like lobotomized communicants and swallow cups of punch in preparation for the real suicide on November 18, 1978. But this wasn't what happened at all. Surviving People's Templars contend that the real White Nights were much subtler events, and you didn't have to be mind-controlled to participate. Originally, Jones used the phrase White Night to denote any sort of crisis, and the possibility of death as a result of that crisis. He chose this particular phrase to subvert the fact that our language tends to equate the color black with negativity. Blacklist, blackmail, black magic. He decided the phrase white knight destabilized that concept. Not a bad point, but a really bad motive. Over time, as Jones grew more deranged and power-starved, the term evolved to mean a slew of insidious things. Some say white knight described occasions when Jones convinced followers to arm themselves with makeshift weapons and stay up for days on end, prepared to defend their promised land to the death against attacks he swore were coming but never did. Others remember the term referencing the dozen or so meetings when people approached a microphone and declared their willingness to die, that very night if necessary, for the cause, the People's Temple term for living in service of the group, not the self. There's also the story that white nights were weekly events when Jones would keep the group up all night to discuss community concerns. And then there are those who've said a white night was simply any meeting in which Jones mentioned death. The congressman's visit confirmed what Jones had suspected for a long time. He couldn't keep this thing up forever. Jonestown was a failure. Too many people were trying to leave. He was doomed to be found out and dethroned. So he gathered everyone in the main pavilion and told them the enemy was on their way to ambush them. They'll shoot some of our innocent babies. They'll torture our people. They'll torture our seniors. We cannot have this, he announced. It was too late to escape. We can't go back. They won't leave us alone. They're now going back to tell more lies, which means more congressmen, and there's no way we can survive. Then he made known his wish. My opinion is that we be kind to children and be kind to seniors and take the potion like they used to take in ancient Greece and step over quietly because we are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act. The words were smooth, as they had always been, but surrounded by armed guards, residents were presented with two options: die by poison or be shot trying to escape. Where and when did Jones get all that cyanide? According to a CNN report, he'd been secretly stockpiling the stuff for years, preparing for the day he'd need to use it, whenever that might be. Allegedly, Jones obtained a jeweler's license in order to purchase the chemical, which can be used to clean gold. This is what every leader of the half-dozen suicide cults in history have done, taking an apocalyptic stance on the universe. With them at its center, they believe their imminent demise means everyone else must go down too. For them, followers' lives are chips on the table, and if they're going to lose either way, they might as well go all in. But hands-on killing is a dirty job. They're in the business of opportunism and manipulation, not murder. So as soon as they feel their grasp on power start to slip, they bear down on forecasts that the world is coming to a gruesome, unstoppable end. The only solution, the leader preaches, is suicide, which, if conducted in a specific way at a certain time, will at the very least render you a martyr, and at most, literally transport you to the kingdom of God. Their loyalists back them up, echoing their words, pressuring any doubters to follow along. A few gutsy People's Templars tried to argue with Jones that day. One of them was Christine Miller, a Black senior member who frequently stood up to Jones. A poor Texas girl who grew up to become a successful LA county clerk, Christine had opened her purse countless times for Jones, in whom she placed ardent faith. But her willingness to compromise with him had limits. By the time she reached Guyana, where members were supposed to live simply and communally, 60-year-old Christine refused to give up wearing the jewelry and furs she'd worked so hard for. Known for her unyielding frankness, she and Jones had a love-hate relationship that often turned tense. At one meeting, Jones became so exasperated by Christine's opposition that he pulled a gun on her. "You can shoot me, but you are going to have to respect me first," she retorted, and he backed down. If there were a time for Jones to heed Christine again, it'd be on March 18, 1978. Christine approached the mic at the front of the pavilion and tried to defend her fellow members' right to live, suggesting they look for alternative outs. Spare the children. Flee to Russia, maybe. It's not that I'm afraid to die, but I look at the babies and I think they deserve to live, you know? She contested. I still think as an individual I have a right to say what I think, what I feel. We all have a right to our own destiny as individuals. I feel like as long as there's life, there's hope. Jones let her speak. He even complimented her agitation. But ultimately, the choice was made for her. Christine, he said, without me, life has no meaning. I'm the best thing you'll ever have. Later that afternoon, everyone under that canopy, including Christine, the guards, and eventually Jones himself, who took a pistol to his head, was gone. You can get just the tiniest sense of Jones's coercive preaching style in a piece of audio known as the Jonestown death tape. The 45-minute recording captures the final speech Jones gave in the pavilion. Death is not a fearful thing. It's living that's cursed, he proclaimed from his pulpit, as parents, by his command, squirted fluid-filled syringes into their babies' mouths, then had no choice but to administer their own doses or have someone else finish the job for them. Upon swallowing the bitter punch, followers were escorted outside one by one, where they perished, bodies convulsing, collapsing, and coming to stillness on the lawn. Forever a peacock, Jones made the death tape himself. Now it's public record, and you can listen to it online. Survivors like Odell Rhodes, who was one of only 33 to evade the poisoning that day, he hid under a building until nightfall, maintain that Jones doctored the tape, stopping and starting to white out bursts of protest, commotion, and cries of agony. The death tape is a subject of intense fascination. At least half a dozen different people, including religion scholars and FBI agents, have taken cracks at transcribing it. Eyes pinched shut, headphones turned all the way up, trying to catch and confirm every last line. If listening to nearly 1,000 people squabble with Jones and each other mere moments before the infamous tragedy weren't hair-raising enough, the death tape's haunting soundtrack makes it stranger than fiction. There's a score of faint music playing underneath all the talking, which sounds like it was added later for effect. As it turns out, the tape originally contained a series of soul tunes. Jones taped over them, resulting in a ghost recording of muffled, tempo-warped melodies. At the very end, after the speech is over, you can hear "I'm Sorry," a 1968 R&B song by the Delphonics, played at half speed like a church organ. Even in this brief excerpt of the death tape, you can get a chilling impression of Jones's rhythmic repetition and deceptive hyperbole. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We have been betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed. I've never lied to you. The best testimony we can make is to leave this goddamn world. I'm speaking as a prophet today. I wouldn't sit up in this seat and talk so serious if I did not know what I was talking about. I don't want to see you go through this hell no more, no more, no more, no more. Death is not to be feared, not to be feared. It's a friend, it's a friend. Let's get gone, let's get gone, let's get gone. Death is 1,000,000 times more preferable than 10 more days in this life. Hurry, my children. Sisters, good knowing you. No more pain now, no more pain. Free at last. The death tape is a poem, a curse, a mantra, a betrayal, a haunting, and proof of language's lethal power. 2. I was a spooky kid who grew up on cult tales, so I've been tuned into Jonestown stories ever since I can remember. My dad often compared Jim Jones to Chuck Dietrich, the manic leader of Synanon, Though Dietrich never led a mass suicide, my dad's half-sister Francie, who spent her elementary school years in Synanon, told me that if Dietrich had stayed in power a little longer, she could have seen it happening.
Okay, so we're at part 2, 2 hours, 1 minute and 26 seconds. So if I can, I'll record the next batch next time. So keep an eye out. Thank you for watching, and God bless.